Good morning, everybody. My name is Evan Medeiros. I'm the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody today to today's webinar on Chinese perspectives on cyber governance, try and understand what ideas China is putting forward to shape cyber global governance norms. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars we've been hosting for the last several months, trying to understand China's approach to global governance, where the Chinese are trying to shape global rules, norms, and institutions, and of course, how much success are they having? And today's virtual panel brings together three wonderful experts to discuss Beijing's vision of cyber governance, including the much discussed term digital sovereignty, and importantly, Beijing's efforts to influence multilateral mechanisms related to cyber norms. Now, today's event is sponsored by the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. I want to thank my colleagues, Eleanor Albert and others for their assistance setting up today's webinar. What I'd like to do is begin with an introduction to our three wonderful experts, and then we're going to start our discussion. Now, after we talk amongst ourselves for about 30-40 minutes, we will have a period for Q&A. So we ask all of our listeners and watchers at the bottom of their screen, there's a Q&A box for them to just pop that open. Or if you're watching on YouTube, to just submit a question via the question and answer function. And we will have, we welcome a robust exchange with everybody watching today's discussion. So in alphabetical order, we have Shui-Chen Chen, who's an assistant professor in politics and international relations at Northeastern University in London, and a visiting research fellow at the London Asia Pacific Center for Social Science, which is part of King's College in London. Secondly, we have Rachel Ann Hulvey, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science at UPenn and a graduate affiliate of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. She's an incoming assistant professor at Indiana University. Congratulations, Rachel. And during 2024-2025, which I guess is right now, she is a postdoctoral fellow at the world-famous Columbia Harvard China and the World program, set up by two of the great professors of Chinese foreign policy, Tom Christensen and Ian Johnson, who we've all been reading for a very long time. Last, we've got John Lee. He's the director of a consultancy called East-West Futures, and he's currently a visiting fellow with the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and a researcher at the Leiden Asia Center, and he's coming to us from Switzerland, from Zurich. Is that right, John?
That is correct.
Great, great. Well, thanks for joining us today. Okay, so to jump into this issue, we're going to begin by asking John to kick us off by laying out the principles and the pillars of China's cyberspace government and its data regulation regime. What do concepts like digital sovereignty mean for China? How do they relate to American ideas, European ideas, Russian ideas? Have Chinese views of cyber governance, John, have they changed over time? We really need you to set a baseline for us to understand China's ideas, and maybe if you can get into a little bit of the domestic politics. Where do they come from in China? What agencies are important? So John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Evan, and greetings to everyone who's joining us from sunny Switzerland. It is a rather dark room that I'm talking to you from, but I will try in the space of 7 or 8 minutes to describe what is probably the most comprehensive regime for cyberspace governance in the world at this point. But I think it's important at the outset, as Evan said, we have to look at the big picture, which is that, of course, China is not alone in seeking essentially to give the state more control in cyberspace. It may represent one end of a continuum, but we do live in a world, of course, where, to just give one example, we are back in the United States in the land of antitrust investigations against major ICT companies, where the European Union is rapidly rolling out a series of legislative pieces which will intrude, and again, this is manifested in actions against particular companies much more on how cyberspace runs. But perhaps to zoom out and focus on what cyberspace means from the viewpoint of the Chinese authorities, I think it's important to firstly recognize the continuity. So control over information in all its forms has, throughout the reform and opening era, been a top priority for China's leaders. And if we just give one example, from the very outset of China's connection to the global internet, for instance, the infrastructure was designed to facilitate essentially state control over data flows inside and outside of China in terms of specific infrastructural choices. So that hasn't changed. What has, I would suggest, is the relative priority that has been given in the reform and opening era to using cyberspace as an engine for economic growth versus mitigating the risks that come with it. And again, this is not, if you like, a perspective unique to China, because all over the world, we see governments recognizing several decades on into the internet's existence, the threats and the risks that come from the untraveled flow of information. There has to be a balance struck. And China, as I mentioned, is one end of the spectrum. So if you had to typify what's happened under Xi Jinping, I would say if you take Xi at his word, which has been repeated at many levels of the Chinese system consistently for the 10 plus years since he came to the top jobs, it is to give security a co-equal priority with economic development and other uses of cyberspace in how the Chinese state approaches it. Now, what that means in practice, I think you can characterize along three avenues. Firstly, more centralized supervision. So China, the ICT sector and what we think of as the Chinese private sector in cyberspace has developed in what is probably not accurately called a Wild West environment, but certainly looked like it in many ways for decades. And the emphasis was on the uptake of information technology, again, to drive China's economic growth, without essentially the security apparatus in all its forms keeping up. So that's been flipped. And the first element, as I mentioned, is centralization, where you have bureaucratic apparatus put in place, for example, the Central Commission on Cybersecurity and Informatization, which has recently now had Xi Jinping's chief of staff appointed to head it, to provide more oversight over what's going on. Secondly, we have the import substitution progressively of the infrastructure of cyberspace. And people will be familiar, I'm sure now, with chips and the idea of US export controls targeting China and its access to the foundational technologies that you need to run cyberspace, which ultimately, of course, is enabled by infrastructure in the real world, by physical electronics. So acquiring the ability to make these for itself has been another avenue of priority for China. And the third one, which we can get more into in the Q&A, is the regulatory apparatus. So if you see people talking about the Chinese data security law, about any number of other standards and pieces of regulation which are designed to, again, bring order and to increase visibility and control for the Chinese state over what happens on digital networks, all of that again, you can trace back further than Xi Jinping, but certainly within the last 10 years, and in particular since the middle years of 2010s, you've seen that coming together in what, as I mentioned, is the most extensive regulatory regime that the world currently has for governance of cyberspace. Perhaps in the last couple of minutes, and as a segue to my fellow panelists, it's worth talking about norms. So Evan mentioned at the start the concept of cyberspace sovereignty, which is a term you do see often in China, but also he referred to the adaptability of the Chinese system over time in how it implements such concepts, including in terms of what it's willing to tolerate in terms of contributions by Chinese stakeholders, its behavior in international bodies, and so on. So the concept of cyberspace sovereignty, I would submit, is one of these concepts which has actually proved quite flexible over time, and which in the Chinese context may have, again, particular resonances, which we can get into in the Q&A, but which, again, I would suggest is far from unique to China. And one thing that I hope that, just to close my remarks, we do get to in today's webinar is, of course, the idea of the copycat effect, the so-called Beijing effect of other countries copying the Chinese approach to data governance, and what that means for, let's say, the political balance between different systems around the world, but also for international trade and the governance of data flows across borders. But I think that's probably enough of appetizer for the rest of the session. So at this point, I will hand back to Evan and my fellow panelists.
John, thank you. Incredibly helpful. So, John, I think one way for us to better understand China's approach to cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty is to compare it to the GDPR regime in Europe and the American regime as well. Can you sort of help us? Can you compare and contrast China's approach with that of the US and Europe a little bit so we can better understand the nature of what Xi Jinping's trying to do in cyberspace?
Sure. So you often see these three jurisdictions referred to as the three kingdoms, which of course is a nice Chinese cultural reference, though you might, if you're familiar with it, know that one of those three kingdoms ultimately triumphed and swallowed up the other two, which might be an ominous precedent. But if we had to organize it this way, and I think it is actually a useful structure because we are talking about the three biggest economic blocs in the world that correspond to these three, if you like, approaches along that spectrum I mentioned of cyberspace governance. At the one end, I would suggest that you have China, which due to its political system and to the sheer amount of regulatory and bureaucratic infrastructure that's been put in place at this point, is the most intrusive and the most control-oriented. There are many caveats to that, which we'll get to. But let's say that represents one end of the spectrum. At the other end is the United States, which, of course, still, at least at a federal level, has a very nascent approach to data governance. And I won't get into the debates around data privacy and other information security issues. In the US, of course, there is an argument from many advocates in this space that the United States really needs to lead by example by actually putting in place a federal level data governance regime rather than leaving it to individual states or effectively to the free market. But there again, I think it's important to caveat that.
Well, and the US government, John, right? I mean, of course, the US government through the FTC and the DOJ has some role as well, isn't that right?
Oh, yes, of course. So that's not to say that there is no governance in this space, far from it in the US. But in terms of, if you like, the equivalent of a GDPR-like instrument or the Chinese Data Security Act or Data Security Law, rather, or these other very comprehensive pieces of regulation, I think that there is certainly an argument that can be made that the United States is still more at, if you like, the free market, free flow of information end of the spectrum. And then, of course, in between, you have the European Union, though, again, I think it's important to bear in mind that the GDPR is not the only law that is in place, although it's already extremely comprehensive and has been the basis, as many viewers will be aware, for significant problems in terms of data governance transfers between the United States and the European Union. But this is now being complemented by a range of other legislative instruments which are intended to be used, as we can see from the actions, as I mentioned, that are already being taken by the European Commission against US tech giants in the, if you like, antitrust regulatory space. So that's the broad, if you like, framework. I think that it's probably best that we talk about the rest of the world a bit later, just because I do want to give my fellow panelists their contributions first. But it's worth noting that you can, I suppose, trace some inspiration, at least in the regulatory regimes of some other developing countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others are sometimes cited, Zimbabwe, of the Chinese regulatory model. So this is where we get to the idea of a so-called Beijing effect, which again, I think needs to be very nuanced. But it's certainly the case that in a general international environment where we are seeing many more obstacles to international trade in general, but in particular for data transfers, this is actually going to have quite a strong shaping effect on the international order. And that's where I think the idea of three kingdoms, which will export their influence directly or indirectly through their demonstration effect, through the pressure on other countries and companies to conform to their particular models, the so-called Brussels effect in the case of the GDPR and the EU, is going to increasingly impact people's lives. Because, of course, we do live in an increasingly digitized world, and one where even China, as we'll get to, is still very concerned with being connected to the rest of the world.
So would you say, John, that the Chinese concepts of secure and control, when they were originally articulated, were pretty absolutist, but they seem to be confronting the reality of China trying to remain a modern economy in a digital world? So would you say that the Chinese are finding that they need to loosen up and adapt a bit in order to, as you say, remain connected to the rest of the world? What do you see as the sort of direction of travel of Chinese thinking and Chinese policies in cyberspace?
I think it's important because there is so much talk about Xi as a new Mao and a return to a command economy centralized model in China now, that we do keep this in perspective. I know I myself referred to greater centralization, and we've definitely seen that. So, for example, the Central Commission on Cybersecurity and Informatization, which I mentioned, it's a peak level body, interagency, which is now run by Xi Jinping's chief of staff, and its remit is to look not only at the traditional information security issues that many of us think of when we say China and cyber, but also the infrastructure security, the defense against cyber attacks, and all the other elements of what we would call cyberspace governance. That said, you can also trace the adaptability in the Chinese system over time, right up to the most recent developments. So, for example, Cyberspace Administration of China, an organ I haven't mentioned yet, but again, a very significant one in terms of the actual implementation of the system and the, if you like, regulatory calls that are made in China. Recently released regulations concerning China's data export regime. But if you look at those, you will see that they are still trying to strike a balance between the imperative for greater control and for review, for example, by Chinese authorities of what is sent across the border, and the need to facilitate essentially international trade and exchanges. So they still, for example, include flexibility for digital free trade pilot areas where the regime will, in theory, be more relaxed. And these will obviously apply in the coastal regions, the most economically developed and internationally connected parts of the country. As well as separating, for example, personal information, which already has its own, I won't call it a GDPR equivalent, but let's say its own piece of legislation governing it in China, from other concepts such as important data, where there will be a heavier regulatory hand. So I think that even if you look at what's being done right now in China, it is still very much within a framework of needing to be integrated with the global economy, but more on China's terms. And I would suggest that this is actually quite a good way of conceiving how China under Xi Jinping has been drifting in general terms. That if we talk about the infrastructure security side, for instance, my own work focuses a lot on the chip sector and on semiconductors and China's quest to be more self-reliant in the so-called core technologies. Even in this area, I think the Chinese authorities have a very clear understanding of the limitations of the Chinese economy and its need for the rest of the world. There is no quest for autarky. Rather, they talk about self-reliance, meaning, if you like, reducing the possibility of being cut off from such essential technologies, but certainly not expecting they can invent everything themselves or that they won't need foreign markets or data exchanges. So the system, I think, is still responsive enough to you could argue whether it's optimal or not, but certainly to try to strike a balance between the greater imperative for security and political control versus the need to continue exchanging data through some kind of interface with the outside world. And again, I do need to highlight the fact that China is far from the only jurisdiction that's doing this. And if we talk about, again, the, if you like, economy and infrastructure side, this is in a context where, again, the United States, the European Union, Japan, India, South Korea are all seeking a higher level of import substitution, reshoring in critical technologies, most obviously the chip sector. Yeah, at this point, perhaps back to you, Evan.
Okay, thank you, John. That's wonderful. Okay, now I want to turn the conversation to Rachel to discuss ways that China is actively shaping global views on cyber order. Basically, what are the tools, Rachel, that Beijing has been using to promote its views of cyber sovereignty, and how much influence is that actually having in a very practical way? Rachel, over to you.
Great, and thank you so much for the invitation to join the panel. And thank you, John, for kicking us off. I'll pivot from the domestic perspective to then the international focus and sharing more of China's strategies. And to do so, I'd like to share some slides here. So I think it's important to keep a perspective that the focus that we have here on cyber governance is part of China's larger grand strategy and motivation to shape international order, turning from merely integrating into existing order to now actively shaping it. And as General Secretary Xi Jinping argued, China is no longer playing the role of a passive participant, but instead it's actively building and leading international order. And this is particularly the case in cyber governance, where you see China actively building and leading reform. At the World Internet Conference, which is an institution that China hosts, you see calls and statements made about the existing rules, that they are unfair and inequitable. And as you see here, that they do not address the interests of a majority of countries. And what I find in my research is that China has been quite successful in its attempts at the international level to impose reforms on the international system. So you see China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states proposing resolutions to the United Nations General Assembly that would shift away from the US vision of internet freedom. And what I find is that these proposals have been quite successful. Here I have plotted the vote counts from the United Nations General Assembly. In red, you can see the votes for reform, that many countries, in fact, a majority of the United Nations is voting with China and the SCO for reform. And you have a much smaller proportion of countries that are voting against it. And so this allows China to generate new forms of order and then ultimately start developing new cyber norms. And the way that China does this is through the power of narratives. As Xi Jinping argued, the competition between great powers in cyberspace is not just about technical superiority alone. Instead, it's also about ideas and discourse power. The competition between the US message, the long-standing message of internet freedom and the rights of individuals to access information online from anywhere in the world, to China's message of cyber sovereignty and the need for a focus on government control and the right of every government to set its own domestic policies. And what I am arguing today is that discourse power is really the important tool for China's ability to influence and mobilize support for changes in international order. It involves using narratives. And the evidence from building order in cyberspace is that China does face an image problem that limits the willingness of other countries to mobilize with China initially. But by using messaging, particularly the attractive message of cyber sovereignty, it generates followers for China's global leadership. So the concept of discourse power in Mandarin is Huayuquan, which means the right to speak and the right to gain influence. And it's promoted from the highest echelons of power within the Chinese Communist Party. At the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping argued that China must accelerate the construction of discourse power to focus on a narrative system and to really orient China's foreign policy towards telling China's story well and spreading China's voice. And the components of discourse power are to use compelling stories to study what foreign audiences, the values that they hold dearly, and to use this within communication. You can see that it's designed to convince people with reason and move people with emotion. And in the case of cyberspace, the message of cyber sovereignty is drawing from the values of the United Nations and putting forward an entirely different message than the status quo focus on individuals and their fundamental freedoms. So to explain to the audience today how this is different from existing concepts that you may be familiar with, discourse power, of course, is gaining influence through the use of rhetoric. But you may be familiar with soft power, and discourse power, of course, share some similarities. Soft power is gaining influence through an attractive image. Under Nye's conceptualization, especially as the US gained influence, this was done through the power of domestic firms like Madison Avenue and Hollywood that really created an attractive image abroad. Discourse power is distinct because it's using values from the United Nations, namely cyber sovereignty, rather than China's own domestic culture. It's also different from persuasion, which would be gaining influence by causing elites to change their minds, because China is using values that are already widely held and are foundational to statehood. And this is really key for being able to mobilize coalitions and attract support for China's vision of order. So discourse acts as a source of power and shapes China's ability to gain influence. And China is actively participating in the reform and construction of the global governance system, particularly in cyberspace. And to do so, China does need the support of other countries. So it's key to recognize that a rising power like China needs to gain the support of other governments. So this can be, for instance, voting for China's proposals at the United Nations, which allows China to form new institutions, new modes of collaboration, or speech similarity to China, which allows China to develop new norms and put forward a new vision for the way in which global governments should operate. And I argue that there are really two key factors in this. First would be a government's image, the way that they are perceived, and the second would be the message, critically, how is this justified? And it's important to note that even Chinese officials recognize that China has an image problem that limits mobilization with China. So we can see at the party symposium on news and public opinion work that Xi Jinping argued that at present, China's image is being shaped by others rather than being shaped by China. And this has implications for the way in which China is able to shape global alignments and even to use its hard power. For instance, along the Belt and Road, China has been able to construct different projects in the hopes that China could gain goodwill from foreign audiences. But what Chinese scholars have noted in China's domestic writing is that this has really not gone according to plan, particularly because of counter narratives about a China threat and debt trap diplomacy. And this really holds up and limits other countries' desire to mobilize with China. And it also induces caution into other countries' approach. So this is why Chinese officials argue that in cyberspace, it's really important that China is going to be using messaging, particularly the message of cyber sovereignty. You have Fu Ying, who is the former vice minister, arguing that it's China's responsibility to overcome any prejudices that exist through discourse. And Wang Wenqi, who's a former diplomat, argues that the party has historically been quite effective at using discourse. So the need to rely on shared values is something that he advocates for in cyberspace. And of course, China puts forward the message of cyber sovereignty, which is every government has the right to independently choose their own path of cyber development. And also critically, this message of sovereign equality, that all countries have the right to equally participate in global governance and jointly formulate international rules. And so in closing, I just want to note that this is really critically how China is going to mobilize coalitions to build support among other countries. It's not as effective among democracies. And in my conversations with China's delegation at the United Nations, this is quite expected. This is part of their strategy. But among non-democracies, this is really an appealing message, particularly after the Arab Spring, when social media is used to overthrow regimes. It's very appealing to other authoritarian states. It resonates with them. It's also appealing to coalitions like the Non-Aligned Movement and the G77 that have long advocated for sovereign equality. So this is really how China is shaping international order in cyberspace, how it's been successful, and I can come back to more evidence of how China has been doing this within our discussions.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Incredibly interesting and useful. So the gist of your argument is the Chinese are trying to develop discourse power, but they're facing some challenges in doing so. Is that right? So I guess my question is where do we see successes and where do we see failures in an effort to achieve discourse power?
I would say that it's really important to note that within the United Nations, it operates mostly under a majoritarian structure. So if China is able to mobilize a majority of countries to support its proposals, then China can be quite successful at building international order. So within cyberspace, we've actually seen for the open-ended working group, for instance, on information and communications technologies. This replaced the previous group of governmental experts format that was widely advocated by the United States and other democratic countries as the format that should govern interactions. And China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization put forward another resolution to build the open-ended working group to, as they say, create a more democratic and equitable international order. And this attracted support twice, first to create the first version of the open-ended working group in 2018. And then again, there's currently one that's going on from 2020 to 2025. And this is where China's been able to put forward and advance cyber norms in order to really flesh out, as they say, to build this vision of cyber sovereignty. So they put forward many statements about the application of cyber sovereignty to international politics, and put forward many norms. And so it's important to recognize that in consensus formats that China may need to use different strategies, but when a majority is needed, this notion of discourse power can be quite appealing to other developing countries as well as authoritarian states. And that's how China has been able to mobilize support for building new forms of international order.
Right. And could you just give us a flavor for which countries have sort of adopted Chinese ideas and Chinese structures, maybe Chinese technologies?
So at the international level, I look at speech similarity, voting similarity, and the way in which governments are supporting China's vision over the status quo vision of internet freedom. And what I find is that, of course, many authoritarian countries are very supportive of this message of cyber sovereignty. But it's important to note that a lot of developing countries contest what they call cyber colonization, and this immense control that many multinational American technology firms like Google and Facebook have over data. And they also find this vision of cyber sovereignty appealing. You also see governments like India, although they're not outwardly supporting China's proposals and attributing that to China, but in their speeches, you see this alignment and similarity to China's vision of cyber sovereignty. So while we don't see support from NATO countries, and this is expected from the Chinese delegation, you really do see a majority of other countries that find China's arguments and China's discourse power very compelling. And so that suggests the need, when we're thinking about China, not just to focus on its image, but really the way in which it's crafting a compelling message that appeals globally.
And so it's not terribly surprising that non-democracies find China's message appealing. Or China's ideas.
I would say that what's important to note is that there are a lot of non-democracies that don't want to move with China on the basis of its leadership alone. So you can think about other non-democracies like Vietnam, for instance, that would be more cautious about moving with China and supporting it just on the basis of its leadership and its image. And so I think that's why it's really key to understand that this message of cyber sovereignty is really how China gets even authoritarian countries on board and builds a coalition with them. So it's important to understand how China is garnering partners, and the way that it's doing so is by finding a message that can appeal widely. This is part of the domestic writing on this, right? Is that this is not a Chinese concept. This is linking with the United Nations and then putting forward something that can garner sufficient consensus or support in order to build new institutions and to create new cyber norms.
Are there any of all the countries that are interested in Chinese cyber norms, are there any ones that are particularly surprising? Are there any democracies who are embracing China's norms, and why would they be doing that?
I would say at the United Nations, we really do see the European partners holding tight to the message of internet freedom to really support human rights. And so you see a lot of European states that even during the Trump administration, where we saw the United States not advocating for internet freedom as much, we saw the European partners at the United Nations really taking up the charge and advocating for that. But outside of Europe, I would say that many democracies do find they have a tension, right? They want to have greater control over data. And so they do find aspects of China's vision of cyber governance very appealing. This notion of collaboration at the United Nations, the notion of having having a fleshed out vision of cyber sovereignty, something that's more democratic, as China puts it, which means one country, one vote, every country has a voice. That could be quite appealing, especially to large democracies like India. That would be an example I usually come back to as a country that has been quite supportive of China's norms within the United Nations.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And why do you think that these Chinese norms resonate with India, and which norms in particular?
I would say as China is advocating for different norms at the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, including data security, supply chain security, and really we see the Indian delegation advocating for those values as well, and wanting to see a fleshed out vision and really putting the balance. I think it's important to keep in mind that all countries might mention sovereignty or human rights, but it's really the balance that's important. India does place a heavy emphasis on sovereignty and wanting to see a focus on state-led efforts to increase security, particularly at the international level. So we can look at also India's domestic regulations. We've seen them note that data is a really strategic asset, and so we see also at the domestic level some moves towards at times data localization. So there's an appealing need for control, I think, across many different types of governments, and whether it's the message of fairness, the message of control, but a lot of what China, it's important to underscore, a lot of what China is putting forward is attractive to different types of countries at the United Nations, and that really allows China to advance its own agenda.
So last question for you, Rachel, and then we'll invite Xuechun to join the conversation. So Rachel, to what extent have the Chinese used technology, hardware and software, as part of their effort to encourage discourse power, right? Do they use, the prospect of getting access to cheap technology from, Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, etc., as a way, or is it the reverse? In other words, countries that are already signed up to the Chinese vision say, just send in your technology. How should we think about the hardware relationship to the ideas?
It's a great question, because it does come up in that famous quote, right? It's not just about the technical superiority, but it's important, though. In my presentation, I emphasize discourse power and ideas. It's also important to note that China is actively diffusing its technology abroad and investing in data centers and 5G, in smart cities. This is all done under the umbrella of the digital Silk Road. And this is something that I think a lot of countries that might be looking to both the US and China, for instance, you can think about Hungary, for instance, see Chinese technology, see the growth of the Chinese market, and do find that to be appealing. And so this is another way that China is attempting to make inroads. But I think it's important when we take a step back and look at building international order and the need to garner support from other countries. In my own work, I have also collected the data on the countries that are part of China's digital Silk Road, and where China is investing in technology and infrastructure. And when I look at the vote count and when I look at the speech similarity, really what I find is it's about the countries that are going to find China's ideas appealing, where that might resonate. So the authoritarian countries, right? The countries that might not have as much support for existing multi-stakeholder models. Those are the countries that really find China's proposals appealing. It's the ideas, and then controlling for these other material factors. I still find that it's really the ideas and the way that China is messaging that's moving the needle at the international level, and allowing China to really gain influence and sway on the global stage.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful. Shui-Chun, you've been very patient. I want to bring you in to address this issue that we got at a little bit with Rachel about understanding the impact of China's activism on cyber norms. As China's thinking has evolved, do you see it as now, a norm maker? And where is it going to be making norms and changing them? And how is this going to evolve with the U.S. system, the GDPR, et cetera?
Thank you so much, Ivan, and also thank you so much for John and Rachel for already making a lot of wonderful and very insightful comments. And hopefully I'm not going to repeat too much. So I would like to share my thoughts on this broad picture as well. So first of all, I think I would agree like with Rachel, for instance, that China has already demonstrated an increasingly strong intention to become a norm maker or to seek a stronger discourse power in the international arena in terms of cyber governance. However, I think when it comes to China's actual influence or actual impact on, its capability to reshape or reconstruct the normative structure in global cyber governance, I think it really remains to be seen. So I would look at two specific dimensions of cyber norms development. The first dimension is more related to the substance of China's cyber norms. I know we already discussed a lot about the concept of cyber sovereignty, but I just want to point out that I think even though the existing kind of scholarly and policy discussion pays a lot of attention to cyber sovereignty, but I think there are other, for instance, newly emerging norms that I will be discussing in a few minutes. And the second dimension is, again, as Rachel already mentioned, is more about the different venues through which China tries to promote its norms or contest the existing norms. So I will try to start with the first dimension, which is more about the substance of China's norms. And I would argue that when we look at China's cyber norms, they are not really static and fixed. And I think we can see that instead, China's visions and norms about cyber governance have been evolving over time. And then I think more importantly, we can observe that the connotation of cyber norms in China has become increasingly multifaceted or multi-layered. And I think in order to have a much more nuanced understanding of the substance of China's cyber norms, it would be very useful for us to just try to conceptualize norms not as a single entity, but as a norm cluster that consists of, for instance, different components, such as a specific norm cluster might consist of a problem, right? And a specific set of values or principles, and also related behavior to address the problem. So I think when we look at China's cyber norm, we can really identify, for instance, three major and also pressing problems that need to be addressed, right? So the first problem is the existence of a wide range of security concerns that derive from the digital technology developments, increasing cyber attacks, cyber crimes, right? And then also the leaking personal data, and then also China's concern about the political and social stability. But secondly, I think we can also see, again, build on Rachel's point that China is not really happy with the fact that, global internet governance has been developed in a rather unbalanced way. And I think from China's perspective, some countries, and especially the United States, has been acting as a cyber hegemon in China's rhetoric. And also, I think Beijing believes that the distribution of internet resources is really imbalanced and also unjust. So in order to respond and to address these problems, we can see that China has emphasized some major norms. And then one is that cyber sovereignty, which has already been discussed quite extensively by John and Rachel. And then another norm that I found very interesting is China's emphasis on a kind of balanced approach to development and security. Right, so it really calls for a balanced strategy encompassing technological advancement, economic growth, and also safeguarding national security and public welfare. That really featured the necessity of maximizing economic development opportunities while mitigating the growth of security risk. And then we can also see that China calls for a more cautious interpretation of cyber sovereignty, because China really feel that, especially I think in light of the recent US-China tech war, China feels that the issue around revolving around cyber governance has been militarized, securitized, and then also politicized a lot, especially in the Western context. And then as a response, China calls for a much more, cautious interpretation of cybersecurity and call for a more development-focused or development-oriented approach to cyber governance at the international level. So that is the first dimension, which I think invites us to have a more nuanced understanding of the, the flexibility and the richness of China's cyber norms. The second dimension I would like to mention is about the, the venues or the platforms through which cyber governance norms have been promoted or contested by China. So I think at the moment we can see cyber governance as a policy field have already evolved into a so-called regime complex that is really characterized by a complex web of institutional networks at regional, minilateral, and also multilateral levels, right? And I think it has been already mentioned by Rachel that at the international level, we have the United Nations open-ended working groups, or the United Nations group of governmental experts on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. But we can also see that in recent years, an increasing number of regional organizations have also become the key platforms to contest and also to develop cyber norms. And these examples include ASEAN, right, the EU, G7, G20, or BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so on and so forth. So when it comes to China's behavior, I think we can observe that China often tends to make use of regional organization with like-minded actors such as BRICS or such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an initial step to disseminate and promote its cyber norms. And but apart from that, I think China also initiated other relevant mechanisms, such as the Global Data Security Initiative, as a response to the U.S. intention to exclude Chinese technology from the global supply chain. And then other examples, I think, include the creation of the World Internet Conference, right? And then apart from these multilateral or kind of regional initiatives, I think I also want to add another example is Chinese firms or Chinese companies' effort to promote China Lab standards in the standard development organizations such as the ITU. So I think if you have any kind of additional questions, we can discuss that further in the Q&A.
Thank you, Sricha. Very interesting. So I'm going to probe the same line of thinking that I used with Rachel, which is we know the Chinese have been very effective and creative at the global level, in the UN in particular. You made an excellent point about how the Chinese have been promoting their views and their norms in regional organizations. That tracks very closely with other dimensions of Chinese diplomacy. But in your assessment, how much effect is China's approach having, right? Where if you can't actually point to a success, though pointing to success or failure would be interesting, maybe you can help us develop sort of some kind of heuristic, some set of tools for how we could begin to evaluate the effectiveness? Because, you know, in the study of Chinese foreign policy, we know China is basically present in most regions and now in most, you know, venues and very active on most issues. The question is less about presence and more about influence. So how do you think about that influence question and evaluating it and judging it?
Thank you so much, Ivan. I think that's a wonderful question, which also is a question that I've been trying to work on, like at the moment with my research project. And I think I have to acknowledge that this is a very challenging and also difficult question to be answered, especially when it comes to China's actual influence, like regarding the global cyber governance regime. But I think there might be a couple of indicators that we can look at. And then I think Rachel already mentioned some of the potential indicator at the empirical level. For instance, how many third countries or other regional organizations that might share similar values and norms with China. But here I want to put a question mark because I think there is a difference between norm convergence or and norm diffusion. So for instance, how can we really
so the difference between norm convergence and norm diffusion.
And norm diffusion. So
okay,
which
for the non-academic listeners,
yeah,
explain it in very simple terms, the difference.
Yes. So basically, to put it in a very simple way, so how can we argue let's say India and China, they all promote the idea of cyber sovereignty. But at empirical level, how can we argue that India is promoting cyber sovereignty is because of the promotion from China? Or do they simply share the same values? And also here, I want to also point to another very important and also interesting phenomena, like especially when it comes to the European side. I think, as Rachel mentioned, I'm not sure how many of you have been aware of the fact that the European Union in recent years has been promoting the concept of digital sovereignty and technological sovereignty. It really becomes part of the EU's overarching strategy as well. But how can we really evaluate the similarity and differences between China and the EU in terms of the concept of sovereignty? So I think this is another very interesting question. But coming back to the potential kind of indicators, I think apart from looking at the discourse level, I think we can also try to look at maybe in the future, right? So in terms of future research, we can also look at to what extent China's regulation or the standards that China's or Chinese government, Chinese firms have been promoting have been internalized or institutionalized in a third country. So I think that might be some, kind of evidence we can look at. So it's a little bit similar to the evaluation of the EU's GDPR, because we can easily see that many, for instance, Asia-Pacific countries, including Singapore and Japan, their regulation in terms of data protection has been influenced by the EU's GDPR. And then that can be one evidence. But the question is, can we really observe the same phenomena when it comes to China's influence?
So I guess my question to all of you then is, do we have any evidence of that? We know the Chinese want discourse power. We know that they're very effective at working in the UN system, though evidence of practical impact is still a little preliminary. We know they're very good at working through regional organizations, but actually evidence of them affecting the regulations, Shui-Chun?
Yes, I think I can tentatively provide a kind of small evidence. So, for instance, we know that through the Digital Silk Road projects, right, China is trying to expand its footprint in terms of digital infrastructure. And then I think one example is that with the digital infrastructure construction, for instance, in African countries, Huawei is strongly kind of inclined to push its own network solution, which is called the IPv6 approach. And then I think perhaps
what is that? What is that a little bit? I mean,
yeah, so basically I think it's a kind of, let's say, put it in a simple way, it's a kind of technology standard that has been preferred by Chinese company and also by Chinese government. And then we can see that through this kind of digital Silk Road project or through this expansion of China's digital infrastructure in third regions, we might find kind of incrementally, we might be able to find evidence of the third countries adopting incrementally those regulations or standardized kind of prescriptions that have been preferred by China. Sorry, it's for IPv6+. Yeah.
Got it. John, I want to bring you back into the conversation because you're currently in Singapore. You're a student of Southeast Asia, and of course, the Chinese consider Southeast Asia to be their economic and strategic backyard. So the question is, do you see much evidence of convergence in Southeast Asia with Chinese norms, so Chinese ideas, maybe Chinese technical standards like Xuechan talked about? I mean, certainly there's a lot of Chinese technology floating around, whether it's cellular technology, broader IT systems. How should we think about Southeast Asia in this conversation?
Thanks, Evan. I should clarify, I'm actually in Switzerland at the moment, although I am on a visiting fellowship remotely with ACS. Though
Right.
I was in
Singapore.
Sure. I was in Singapore recently, so I think I have some on the ground perspective. I think it really needs to be sliced up by different subjects because cyberspace is a big beast. If we want to talk about norms around data transfer, for instance, I definitely lean towards Xuechan's view that we need to see a lot of this as convergent evolution rather than copycat behavior. In that if you have certain policy goals in mind, then you're probably going to arrive at a particular solution, whether or not another country has already done that. And a lot of the pressure for data localization comes from similar national security concerns. Incidentally, since the EU keeps coming up, there's certainly a lot of American commentators who would argue that the GDPR and subsequently the new legislation that's coming out of DMA and so on is basically industrial policy by stealth. Or perhaps not even so stealthy on the part of the EU. So that kind of also brings it back to the economics, which is again that if you want to capture a larger share of the profits, for example, move up the value chain, to use the term in these globalized industries, then there's a reason why China has been successful in doing that. And so you are starting to see more developing countries imitating certain policies. Again, not necessarily imitating, but coming to the conclusion that it's necessary. For example, I mentioned Indonesia, just to return to Southeast Asia, which does have, as I understand it, quite strict data localization laws. But of course, one other thing they now do, which is sometimes portrayed as, if you like, copying the Chinese, though, of course, Chinese companies have been some of the most affected by this, is requiring more industrial value add in country. So Indonesia is a big natural resource exporter, but they have laws for certain materials now, nickel most famously because of its importance for batteries for electric cars, which they require now to be processed in country. The idea being that if you only export the raw ore, then you will always remain at the very low profit end of the value chain.
But of course, John, that is industrial policy, right? That's not norm convergence, right? That's just Indonesia trying to capture as much of the battery value chain as possible. So how about on the idea convergence, norm convergence?
Yeah. I mean, you can certainly find examples where there appears to be some kind of, if you like, influence effect, not necessarily meaning that, again, the Chinese are being copied directly, but, memoranda of understanding came out, for example, between some of the ASEAN countries. I think off the top of my head, Thailand and one or two others from the last ASEAN level digital governance talks with China. Now, we don't know exactly what was agreed, but again, I mentioned Vietnam before as another country which, despite its rather complex security relationship with China, certainly appears to have modeled certain aspects, or at least, again, to have convergence of certain aspects of its digital governance regime with China's. But some of this might simply be the fact that the Chinese are first movers. If you're the first one to come up with a particular solution, then of course, if other people follow a similar path, it looks like they're converging, where in fact, it may simply be common tools for a common solution. If I had to characterize, if you want to keep it at the normative level, Southeast Asia, I would say that you also need to be very conscious of distinctions between the different countries. I mean, it's not the European Union where you do have a high level of regulatory centralization. There is no political foundation for an equivalent to the GDPR, for instance. So as I think Xuechen mentioned, some countries like Singapore probably would be seen, normatively speaking, as much more aligned with the EU or with the US. Others, like Indonesia, on the face of it, more like China, and then still others in between.
Yeah, yeah. John, very, very well said. I tend to agree with you that regime type in Southeast Asia is probably a better predictor of how they choose or which norms they choose to agree to and legislate and regulate based on than their relationship with China. Right. But Vietnam may be a very interesting case study along these lines. Rachel, I wanted to invite you into this conversation a little bit before we get to the Q&A. Did you want to contribute here?
Yes, I just wanted to point out when we're looking at the domestic level, Jennifer Pan has a great piece on whether it's possible for countries to emulate China and then actually replicate its model. And it's very, very hard to replicate what China has been doing in the information and digital space in other nations, just because China got such a head start. So I think that's why in my work, I've really been looking at the international level and how China has been setting the agenda, particularly through my conversations with China's delegation at the open-ended working group. China really sees itself as having set the agenda for this turn away from the internet freedom approach. And when President Clinton famously said trying to regulate the internet would be like trying to nail Jello to the wall, the delegation really emphasized that China was putting forward an alternative vision and sees itself as putting forward the International Code of Conduct for Information Security that was submitted to the United Nations General Assembly with Russia and the SCO states. China really played a big role in like penning those documents and putting the emphasis instead of on individuals, on states' rights and their responsibility. Then the open-ended working group is kind of this event of, as China's delegation said, of historical significance that all countries can sit at the table instead of really being in these more multi-stakeholder or government and private actors collaborate together, that now it's more entirely state-led. And then the data security initiative is something to watch now. We've seen data security language woven into consensus reports. So to bring it back to your question of success, I think we can attribute and we can see evidence of China being very successful in the international arena of both providing evidence that is actively trying to set the agenda and shape global norms. And then we also see evidence of where China has been successful at recruiting countries to sign on to China's approach.
Great. That's wonderful, Rachel. Okay, so I'm going to go to, we have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to go to the Q&A. We've got a long list of a variety of different questions. So it's great to see that there's a lot of very active watchers and listeners out there. Okay, I've got one sort of generic question from the audience about that asks, quote, even though people talk a lot about it, how can sovereignty be determined in cyberspace? I know it's a bit of a generic open-ended question, but it's an interesting one. How, we throw around terms like, data sovereignty and cyber sovereignty. What are we really talking about here? Anybody want to, this is sort of a first principles type of question, so I like it. Anybody want to take a shot at it?
I might just maybe I definitely want to
Please,
give my fellow panelists the chance to elaborate, but just to use one example, what I meant when I said that the Chinese approach has shown some evolution over time, the attitude towards an international governance body, specifically ICANN, for instance. The Chinese authorities were very, if you like, hawkish on ICANN and its alleged role as an American instrument. So the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, for those who aren't familiar. But over time became much more comfortable, basically, with how the organization was performing its function in practice, despite the fact that it is an NGO headquartered in the United States. So I would certainly argue that the Chinese concept of cyber sovereignty is probably a control-centric one, but what that means in practice there's a lot of space to adapt to how things are functioning in practice.
But John, doesn't it really isn't the whole idea of cyberspace sovereignty that a central government of a country, of a nation, controls all of the data or some of the data that emanates from within that country? Isn't that fundamentally what cyber sovereignty is all about? Is how much should the central government be able to control? Is that really what we're talking about?
I think that it's potentially a much larger concept than that. I will keep referring back to the EU because I happen to live and work here. But the EU concept of digital sovereignty, for instance, which new laws like the Digital Markets Act, which is the one that the action against Apple recently has been taken under, explicitly framed in terms of digital sovereignty. But what exactly that means is not clearly defined, to be quite blunt about it. I mean, in the case of the DMA, and I will come back to China briefly, I think it's quite clear that the market power of American tech companies in the European economies is obviously not seen as consistent with the abstract concept of digital sovereignty that is being advanced by the DMA and by the other pieces of the expanding European governance regime. And this is where it comes back to economic and industrial policy. I think increasingly you are going to see integration of the normative debate with all of the reshoring and industrial policy focused activity, just because everything is digital now. I mean, it's impossible to talk, for instance, about bringing home chip production, which is the basis of everything, because everything is electronics now, and which itself is often described as a sovereign issue, without talking about data transfer and hence cyber sovereignty issues, simply because these are globalized industries where a lot of the activity is still outsourced to other countries, and how that data is allowed to move back and forth is a big issue. But to kind of just round that out on China, I think again, having control over the important stuff is really the bottom line for the Chinese authorities. And I mentioned the new CAC approved regulation on data export before. I think, again, if you look at how that deals with important data and cross-border transfers, reserving to the Chinese authorities the right to stop stuff crossing the border and to review it where there is a high chance that it might touch on a particular security interest. I mean, that's where the buck stops, if you like. At the same time, that leaves a lot of room, of course, for less important or strategically critical stuff to simply be allowed to go freely back and forth, because that's needed for the functioning of a modern economy.
Interesting. Rachel or Shui-Chan, would either of you like to come into this? I know it's a very, very open-ended question. What does sovereignty even mean in cyberspace? Shui-Chan?
Yes, or Rachel, did you want to go ahead? Sorry.
Oh, no, please, you start and then I'll hop in.
Okay, so I think because John already mentioned about what cyber sovereignty can mean for China, but I think I had some reflection on, for instance, what cyber or digital sovereignty might mean for the European Union, let's say, because I think here, when we look at the case of the EU, it is a little bit counterintuitive to look at the concept of digital sovereignty, because we know that the European Union, as a regional integration project, it's actually built upon the idea of transferring their sovereignty into a supranational level of entity. But then I think when it comes to digital technology, the EU kind of re-emphasized the idea of sovereignty here. And then I think slightly different from the case of China, I think what the European Union emphasized in the case of technological or digital sovereignty is that the EU has been trapped between the US and China, I would say. And then when we look at the European Union's capability or the existence of the tech giants or the big tech companies, I think the EU has been lagging behind. So I think here, for the EU's perspective, it's really about how to reduce the dependence on external suppliers regarding critical digital technologies. So I mean, this can offer a slightly different version or interpretation of sovereignty in the European context, maybe.
Rachel?
I love this question because I also think a lot about borders in cyberspace. So if I may, I think there are two important shifts to keep in mind when we're thinking about sovereignty in cyberspace. I think there's first the debate of the 1990s of, can the internet be regulated? We first had the borderless vision of the internet. We had the Clinton quote that I mentioned before. And China, with the construction of the Great Firewall, I think definitively show that it is possible to regulate the internet. So then the conversation shifted to a more normative dimension of, should it be regulated from the state level? And you see in the US, Supreme Court jurisprudence, Section 230, and even ICANN, the US put forward a vision that governments should be collaborating with civil society. The civil society should really take the lead in forming opinions. You even see the Internet Engineering Task Force being comprised of engineers, right? And so this was the US effort to say that civil society, who has an interest in the free flow of data, should be sitting at the table and making policies alongside governments, or sometimes even on their own. And really, sovereignty in cyberspace in this dimension for China's intervention is to squarely focus on government rights. I point the listeners to the World Internet Conference, where we have different universities that worked with the Cyberspace Administration of China to put out cyber sovereignty theory. They've had different 1.0, 2.0, but I encourage the listeners here to look at that document because it really fleshes out what China means by this. It means independence, equality, jurisdiction, and also the right to self-defense. And it's important to note that China sees each of these principles as something that governments have the right to do online, and really wanting to codify and institutionalize these principles at the international level.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Okay, I'm going to jump to another question because I think it is a nice follow-up to the first one. And it is, quote, how does China reconcile its preference for state-centric domestic approach to cyber regulation with wanting to maintain connectivity largely for the sake of growth and development? Does this tension challenge its desire to influence and shape cyber norms? So how should we see China reconciling or managing the tension between basically sovereignty and connectivity? Who would like to take a stab at that?
Maybe just briefly on the regulatory side. So again, if you look at the recent data standard that came out from the relevant Chinese technical committee, it is still quite a decentralized approach to defining important data in terms of being as minimally prescriptive as possible. So the focus is more on a normative framework rather than on, for example, listing categories of important data. And again, if you look at the data security law in China, for example, a lot of it is decentralized in the sense that the task of categorizing, for example, important data and other activities is pushed onto the actors. So the companies and other entities that are generating the data in the first place. And then that is progressively centralized through the system. So it is, I guess, kind of typical of the Chinese system in that there is a centralized aspect, but the functioning at the grassroots level is often actually quite decentralized, which should hardly be surprising because, again, that's typical of the Chinese system. The Chinese economy, as again many listeners will know, has always, even in its command days, been actually a much less centralized beast than, for instance, the old Soviet Union's economy was.
But John, I think what the question was getting at was issues sort of related to things like data localization, right? On the one hand, the Chinese want to control a lot of data, right? On the one hand, the Chinese want to have a very secure supply chain of technologies, but policies on secure supply chains, policies on data localization are also likely to complicate the ability of Chinese businesses and foreign businesses to operate, right? If you're a foreign bank, data localization is just a nightmare, right? And similarly with secure supply chains, right? The Chinese just, I mean, you mentioned you're very focused on chips and semiconductors, right? I mean, the Chinese have huge problems now. So how should we think about the balance in that context?
Well, again, the new CAC regulation actually significantly simplifies the job, I think, for cross-border data transfers. Again, the approach seems to be and this is iterative in that I think the Chinese authorities have learned from the negative blowback that they have had from through various channels from foreign stakeholders over just, as you highlighted, Evan, how difficult this makes it to do business in China, especially for smaller actors. So, for example, benchmarks in terms of the number of users that you need to have before certain obligations kick in. Again, a reduction in the effective scope of data that is subject to an automatic obligation for review. That has been trimmed back, basically.
I see.
That appears to be quite clearly a response to, again, the negative feedback, presumably from lots of Chinese stakeholders too, in terms of how this is affecting the Chinese economy's ability to function. Now, when it comes to the most critical security issues, I don't think it's that difficult. And if you wanted to mirror image, you could look at, for example, what the White House's executive order back in February, I think, did with respect to certain countries of concern and to transfer of certain categories of data for US government officials, for example, abroad to, I mean, specifically China, Russia, North Korea, the usual suspects. But again, the very fact that it's limited to a certain group of countries, that it's limited to certain types of data, shows that it is, in practice, a balance can be struck. You just need to work out in practice where that line is. And some of this stuff is just going to have to play out. And based on the feedback loops, the regulators in every jurisdiction will fine-tune the balance. But I don't think that it's an insuperable problem. I mean, Rachel referred to the Jello being nailed to the wall. This is the next level, if you like, in that not only in the domestic space did the Chinese authorities prove basically that you can control the political discourse. But now in the cross-border data transfer space, I'd suggest that we will see governments are actually able to impose quite a lot of controls without killing the golden goose, in that you already have this with the GDPR, for example. It's not just personal information, mixed data sets. So including commercial data where there's personal information involved, that has been restricted under the GDPR for many years already. But the European Union still does business with countries around the world. So it's not, again, a problem that is insoluble. It will just take time and will be worked out in different ways depending on which country we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, Shui-Chan, how do you think about China's ability to strike the balance? Shui-Chan.
Thank you. So I think I just want to add another kind of dimension, which is not really kind of related to the central government of China, but I think it also depends on, for instance, whether Chinese firms and also those big Chinese firms will develop adequate capability to adapt themselves to other regulatory frameworks. For instance, we see how it goes with the TikTok in the United States, and then also try to imagine that if China really wants to encourage their companies, especially tech firms, to go out in Europe or in Southeast Asia as the process to expand its connectivity, then I think ultimately these companies need to develop their own kind of resources, capability, and know-how to integrate or to adapt themselves to the new regulatory environment of other countries and regions as well.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
I would just add on data localization. I think when the cybersecurity law was first issued, there was a lot of conversation about how Article 37 and the requirements to store data within China, while also conducting the cross-border checks, would actually be managed in practice. And so you had kind of two different categories of firms, of US firms like Apple putting data on servers within China. And then you have a lot of smaller firms that were having a hard time understanding how to manage the cross-border checks. So I think there is a tension, and it took China quite some time to really focus on the implementation after publishing such a stringent law, and really kind of, as John was mentioning in his remarks, really setting the standard for what a tightly controlled cross-border check would look like. So I think in this tension, you see a move that will happen first for a strong state-centric regulation, and then some conversation about how to maintain connectivity, how to maintain trade, despite the focus on security. So getting the balance right, as John so nicely mentioned, between security and development, I think is always going to be a point of concern, and we've seen this play out with the cybersecurity law.
John, you raised your hand. Did you want to come back in?
Yeah, maybe just to recap what Shechin and Rachel just said. Of course, a lot of the mitigation will be in China for China. So that's not just applying to cross-border data transfers, of course, for compliance purposes generally, as you see a widening gap between the United States and China specifically, but let's take this as a general rule. The bigger companies especially will simply bifurcate their operations. So whatever they do in China, they won't need to transfer the data as much across borders, because the sourcing for the supply chain, the end markets, all that will be within China. And then they just have a separate operation, for the United States or for the European Union. The problem, of course, is that if you're a smaller company, that's pretty hard to make economical. And so again, one of the things that you've seen in the new Chinese regulation on data export is measures to try and make it a little easier for small and medium enterprises to meet the compliance obligations. But there will be some, if you like, fragmentation effect that's driven by the divergence in data governance regimes, especially between the US and China. But generally, I would say.
Okay, last question, but you're only going to get each of you 2 sentences to answer the question. So it's clear from this very rich, wonderful discussion that the Chinese are very focused on developing discourse power on cyber norms, and they've made a lot of progress. So 2 sentences from each one of you, parting shot as we end this wonderful webinar. How can the US, Europe, and other like-minded countries improve their discourse power in the face of Chinese efforts? Xuechun, if you were the United States and you were Europe, what would you do to compete most effectively?
Thank you so much for the wonderful and also challenging question. So I think from my personal opinion, I think experts in the field of cybersecurity or cyber governance in the United States or in the Western kind of context in general would benefit from having a much deeper and nuanced understanding of China's visions, approaches, and regulatory environment that have been evolving extremely fast. So I think having a deeper understanding of China's approaches, ideas would be very helpful.
Wonderful. Great. Rachel?
I think there are two things to try to get into the two sentences. We can follow up more on this, but I think it's important for the US to focus its messaging on developing countries. I think the message of human rights, at times developing countries see this as really not taking into consideration their position that they're still developing. They want to focus on economic rights. And so I think the US can weave the message of development into the narrative of internet freedom. This has really created a lot of economic growth and allowed the internet to prosper, which has really lifted a lot of growth through the US vision of internet freedom. And then secondly, I think it's important for the US to set the agenda. I think throughout this period, at times the US has merely played a defensive position. I think the US really needs to lead. And I would encourage our listeners to look at the developments that are going on right now with artificial intelligence, and the United States really at the ITU and also at the United Nations level putting forward proposals, which I think is a positive direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, John, over to you. 2 sentences.
Okay, no pressure. So to build on what my fellow panelists said, sentence 1, the focus has to be on the developing countries in general rather than on China and their needs. And sentence 2, that has to be a positive vision in concrete terms of, for example, open market access and other opportunities in the US and the like-minded bloc.
Great. Very, very well said. So Shui-Chun Chun, Rachel Ann Hulvey, John Lee, thanks to all 3 of you for a very rich, very wonderful conversation. I appreciate you answering all of my very pointed questions, but I'm always trying to promote as high quality a discussion and webinar as possible. I certainly understand a lot more. I hope you do too. And I want to thank everybody that was watching or listening today. I'm Evan Medeiros at Georgetown University. Today's webinar was sponsored by our US-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and it's part of a broader series focused on China and global governance. So to all 3 of you, thank you again. This was a wonderful conversation. And to all of those that are watching today, please join us for future sessions. Thanks, everybody.